I had a hunch my wife was gearing up to file for divorce, so I took some precautions and moved my assets. Sure enough, 2 weeks later, she went through with it, only to backpedal once things didn't unfold the way she expected. Hey everyone. I've been lurking around this community for a while now, reading all your stories, never thinking I'd have one of my own to share. But life's funny like that, it throws you a curveball when you least expect it. I've been carrying this around for a few months now, and I think it's time to finally let it out. Just to be clear, I'm not the type to jump to wild conclusions or assume the worst. I try to stay level-headed. Di wife, let's call her D, and I had been together for 7 years, married for 5. As far as I could tell, things were good. We had our share of normal ups and downs like any couple, but nothing that ever set off any real alarm bells. For most of our relationship, we were that couple, completely in sync, solid partners. We'd crack up over dumb inside jokes, get into playful debates over which movie to watch, and just had a rhythm that felt natural. She'd plan these sweet, over-the-top date nights, and I'd surprise her with her favorite takeout when she had a rough day. Everything just felt easy, like we had this whole love thing figured out. So when things started shifting about 6 months ago, it hit me like a freight train. At first, the changes were small, barely noticeable if you weren't paying close attention. She started keeping her phone with her all the time, even just walking to the kitchen or folding laundry. Before, her phone would sit on the coffee table for hours. She never cared who picked it up. One day I joked, "What's up, you running some secret spy ring now?" She laughed and brushed it off, saying work had been emailing her a lot lately. Seemed innocent enough. But a few days later, she added a passcode to her phone. That threw me. She'd never bothered with one before. When I asked about it, just in passing, she said something vague about hackers and online safety. I didn't push the issue, I didn't want to come off as paranoid, but something about it just felt off. And it didn't stop there. She began stepping out of the room to take calls, which she had never done before. It was pretty obvious too, her phone would ring and she'd say, "Oh, I'll be right back," then disappear into the bedroom or head out to the porch. If I asked who it was, she'd casually say, "Just a work friend." Then I noticed she'd started placing her phone face down whenever she set it on a surface. That wasn't something she used to do. I didn't think much of it until one time I reached over to hand her something, and she quickly slid her phone away. It was subtle, blink and you'd miss it, but it stuck with me. But honestly, it wasn't just about the phone. There was a bigger shift happening. She started feeling distant. Conversations that used to flow effortlessly now felt like pulling teeth. If I brought up stuff like, "Where should we go for our anniversary?" or "Think it's time we start saving for a new car?" she'd just kind of nod and say something like, "Yeah, we'll see," and then steer the conversation somewhere else. Then came the moment that really made everything click. She had told me she was meeting a friend for coffee, something she does now and then. Coincidentally, I was running errands nearby, so I thought I'd swing by and surprise her. I figured it'd be a sweet gesture. But when I got there, she wasn't with anyone. She was pacing outside the cafe, phone pressed to her ear. I stayed in the car. Something about the way she was talking seemed serious. I didn't mean to eavesdrop, but I caught bits and pieces, phrases like, "It's almost ready," and "starting fresh soon." Di got dropped. I couldn't make out the full conversation, but it didn't sound like a chat about work drama or a friend venting. It felt bigger. Like something planned. When she got home, I tried to play it cool and asked how her coffee catch-up went. She launched into this whole story about her friend ranting about her boyfriend. It was so oddly specific, I just kind of stared at her for a second. Then out of nowhere, she said something like, "Don't you think we should get all our important stuff together, account info, passwords, documents, just in case of an emergency?" That caught me completely off guard. We'd never had that kind of conversation before. With everything else that had been going on, the timing felt strange. Trying to stay calm, I asked, "What kind of emergency are we talking about here?" She shrugged, real casual. "I mean, you never know, right? What if something happened to one of us? Or what if we needed to make a quick financial decision?" Now, what she said made sense on the surface, it was a logical point. But something about the way she brought it up didn't sit right with me. It felt rehearsed, almost like she'd been waiting for the perfect moment to drop that idea into the mix. I just nodded and mumbled something like, "Yeah, I guess that's smart." But inside, my mind was spinning. Why now? Why the sudden urge to get all our finances in order when we'd always kept things pretty laid back and separate? That night, her words kept echoing in my head. I kept wondering, was this just normal adult stuff I hadn't thought of, or was I being naive? Then I remembered the secret of phone calls, the conversation I'd overheard at the cafe, and how emotionally checked out she'd seemed lately. It was all starting to pile up, and I didn't like the picture it was painting. Up to that point, I hadn't said anything or done much about it. But then, a few days later, she brought it up again. We were in the kitchen, I was making myself a sandwich, and she was scrolling through her phone. Out of the blue, she asked, "Have you given any more thought to organizing the bank stuff? Like, do you know where all our account details are?" I put the knife down and turned to face her. "Alright, what's going on?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light, but steady. "You've been bringing up the money stuff a lot lately. Is there something we need to talk about?" She finally glanced up from her phone, visibly surprised that I had actually pressed the issue. "No, nothing's wrong," she blurted out, a little too quickly, which honestly made me chuckle a bit. "I just think it's important, you know? In case of emergencies." "Emergencies? Like what exactly?" I asked. She just shrugged, her face blank and unreadable. "I don't know. Just, life stuff. It's not a big deal. I promise. I just think it's something we should take care of." But the way she said it didn't sit right with me. It was too vague, like she was dodging the question instead of giving me a straight answer. I nodded along like I accepted it, but inside, my suspicion only deepened. This didn't feel like some random suggestion anymore, it felt like she was keeping something hidden. I just didn't know what. The next day, while she was at work, I decided I needed to dig a little. So I logged into our joint bank account to check things out. What I found wasn't anything huge, but it definitely raised a red flag. There had been several small withdrawals over the past month. Nothing massive, just little amounts here and there, but none of them seemed tied to bills, groceries, or anything I could make sense of. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the pattern was weird. It looked like she'd been quietly pulling money from the account for something, and I had no clue what for. I thought about confronting her, but something told me to hold off. If I was wrong, I'd look like a fool. But if I was right, then I needed to move carefully. It started eating away at me, so I called someone I trusted, an old buddy from college who also happens to be a lawyer. I laid everything out, trying my best not to sound like a paranoid lunatic. After I finished, he said, "Look, I'm not saying something's definitely up, but you're not crazy for wanting to be prepared. If you're worried about protecting yourself, now's the time to do it. Better safe than sorry." He walked me through a few simple legal steps to secure my assets, things I could do quietly, without raising alarms. I'll be honest, taking those steps felt extreme. Like I was bracing for a disaster I hadn't fully seen yet. But the more I thought about it, the more it felt like the smart thing to do. Because if she really was planning something, and every sign pointed to that possibility, I had to look out for myself. It wasn't just about money or property. This was the life we had built together. And as I sat there, thinking about our wedding day, the late-night talks about the future, the dumb little jokes only we understood, I felt this deep ache in my chest. How did we end up here? Taking action felt like crossing a line I didn't want to cross. It felt like I was admitting the trust between us had already been broken. But the truth was, the trust was already on shaky ground. That evening, after she'd left to meet a friend, I sat down at my desk, opened my laptop, and started looking through everything: bank accounts, investments, the deed to our house. Each document I reviewed felt like a quiet betrayal. But there was this steady voice in my head telling me, this isn't betrayal. This is self-preservation. I didn't want to hurt her, I just couldn't shake the feeling that if I didn't act now, I'd regret it later. So I made a list: every account, every asset I could move, and how to do it without setting off alarms. As I typed, it felt like a weight had settled right on my chest. I had trusted her completely for years, and now I was taking steps to shield myself from her. That realization crushed me. I ended up calling my mom. I didn't go into detail, just asked her for a favor. I need you to hold on to a few things for me for a little while, I told her. It's nothing bad. I just need to protect myself, just in case. There was a pause on the other end. I could tell she was trying to figure out what I wasn't saying. Are you okay? She asked, her voice tight with worry. Yeah, I lied. It's just a precaution. Nothing serious. She didn't push. I could hear it in her voice, she knew something was off, but she let it go. Of course, sweetheart. Whatever you need, she finally said. I hung up the phone with this strange mix of guilt and relief swirling in my chest. I hated pulling her into this mess, but knowing she had my back gave me a little sense of stability in the middle of all this uncertainty. By the time Dee got home that night, the ball was already rolling. I had transferred the bulk of my assets, our savings, my investments, even the house, into my mother's name. I left just enough in our joint account to keep things looking normal. She didn't notice a thing. She came in, kissed me on the cheek, and asked if I wanted to watch a movie like it was just any other night. I acted like everything was fine, but inside, I was a mess. Part of me felt horrible, like I had betrayed the woman I promised to stand by. But another part of me felt, strangely relieved. Like I had finally taken back a little control over a situation that had been slipping away from me for weeks. Over the next few days, I did my best to keep things business as usual. I stuck to our routines, acted normal. And weirdly, she seemed content, almost too cheerful at times. But instead of calming me down, it just made me more uneasy. If she was up to something, she was doing a damn good job hiding it. What really got to me, though, was the silence. She never brought up the finances again. Not once. Not even after I'd questioned her the last time. It was like that entire topic had just vanished from her brain. At first, I figured maybe I'd overreacted. Maybe she dropped it because she saw it wasn't a big deal. But the longer I sat with it, the more I realized she was deliberately avoiding the subject. Almost like she was scared to revisit it after seeing how I responded. I caught her watching me a few times, kind of subtly studying my face. Like she was trying to gauge where my head was at, wondering if she should say something. Every time I noticed, she'd immediately look back at whatever she was doing, scrolling her phone, watching TV, pretending to read. It was quick, but it was there. It felt like a waiting game. Like she was hoping I'd bring it up so she wouldn't have to. But I didn't. I couldn't. The silence between us grew thicker by the day, and with each passing moment, I became more convinced that this wasn't just paranoia. She wasn't just dropping the subject. She was testing the waters, but she wasn't ready to dive in. If she was waiting for some kind of reaction or permission, she wasn't getting it from me. I wasn't about to hand her the green light. Whatever she was planning, I needed to stay a step ahead. I didn't know what was coming, or when, but I could feel something brewing, and I wasn't gonna be caught off guard. That night, I went over everything one more time, just to be sure. I checked the documents again, reviewing every detail of the asset transfers I'd arranged with my mom. The house, the savings accounts, the investments, everything had been legally moved into her name, locked away in a trust with zero room for contest. I even called her to double-check that she had all the paperwork in hand. She did. 2 weeks rolled by, and honestly, everything seemed weirdly normal. Too normal, actually. Dee was acting sweet again, affectionate, even. She'd chat about random stuff, like new job ideas or what we should cook for dinner. It threw me off balance. For months, she'd been cold, distant, barely present. Now, all of a sudden, it was like she'd flipped a switch. I started wondering if I'd just imagined everything. Maybe I'd read too much into it all. Maybe the weird behavior was just stress I didn't understand. Maybe I was the one overthinking. But then came Friday night. Out of nowhere, she sat me down on the couch. Turned off the TV. Looked me in the eye and said, "We need to talk." Just like that, my stomach hit the floor. I already knew what she was about to say. I could feel it in my bones. "I think we should get a divorce," she said. Calm. Cold. Like she was talking about needing to change the oil in the car. I stared at her, trying to register her words while she launched into her reasons. She said she needed space. That she felt like she'd lost herself in the relationship. That she wanted to rediscover who she was. All those vague, packaged breakup lines you hear in every melodramatic movie. But it was her tone that got me. There was no sadness in it. No anger. Just detachment. Then she dropped a line that hit differently. "I've made a lot of sacrifices for you over the years," she said, still not looking at me. "And I don't think you've ever really appreciated them. I deserve more." That one stung. It wasn't just that she wanted out, it was the way she said it, like I owed her something. Like she was claiming back dues from a debt I never agreed to. As if the whole marriage had been some one-sided deal where she gave and I took. As I sat there, trying to absorb what she was saying, a new thought crept into my head: why now? And then came the part that made everything click into place. "A friend of mine has been helping me see things more clearly," she said, her eyes avoiding mine. A friend. I didn't say anything, I let her keep talking, but inside, my mind was spinning. Who the hell was this friend? And what gave them the right to be this involved in my marriage? The way she said it, it wasn't casual. It wasn't just someone lending an ear, it sounded like someone had been actively pushing her, building her up to do this. Like they'd helped script her speech. The more she talked about how much she'd sacrificed, the more suspicious I became. Sacrifices? What was she even talking about? She'd always said she was happy. I worked my tail off to give her the kind of life she said she wanted. And I wasn't just writing checks, I was showing up. When she asked to move closer to her new job, I agreed, even though it added an extra 45 minutes to my commute. When she brought up that expensive yoga retreat last year, I made it work. Skipped out on a vacation I'd been looking forward to so she could go instead. When she wanted to switch careers, twice, I supported her, told her to take the risk, told her I'd be there no matter what. Because I believe that's what a good husband does. You put your partner first when you can. I remembered birthdays, little comments she made about things she liked, and I'd surprise her with them weeks later. When she said she felt stuck in a rut, I suggested regular date nights. I listened to her vent about work, friends, her family. Even when I didn't have a clue what to say, I was there. I did my best. I wasn't perfect, but I never stopped trying. So when she hit me with that "I deserve more" line, I didn't buy it for a second. This wasn't about me failing her. This was about something in her shifting. Maybe it was this so-called friend she kept talking about. Maybe it was something else entirely. But the woman sitting across from me wasn't the same one I married. And I wasn't about to let her rewrite our story to fit this new version of herself. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I just nodded and said something neutral, like, "If that's how you feel, I guess we should talk about next steps." She looked surprised. I think she expected me to push back, maybe plead with her to stay. But I didn't. My focus had already shifted. I wasn't interested in changing her mind anymore. I needed to find out what, or who, had sparked this sudden, calculated change. That night, she went to stay at her new apartment, and by Monday morning, I had the divorce papers in hand. And let me tell you, it wasn't just a clean break she was asking for. It was a full-blown land grab. She wanted half the house, all my savings, every investment I had, the car, and on top of all that, spousal support. And I'm talking vague, confusing clauses that made zero sense considering her salary was nothing to sneeze at. It was clear, this wasn't just her being upset. This was strategic. These demands weren't random. They were specific, calculated. It felt like someone had coached her through every word. So I started digging. I couldn't just come out and ask, "Hey, who's been feeding you legal advice and whispering in your ear?" I had to be subtle. I started with her social media. She hadn't blocked me, and though she wasn't a big poster, I scrolled through every tag, every comment, looking for something, or someone, out of place. And then I noticed it. A name kept popping up, Ryan. He'd liked nearly every post. Left the occasional comment. Nothing wild, just enough to stand out. Enough to make me pause. So I clicked on his profile. It was public. At first glance, he looked like your average guy, early 30s, marketing job, nothing flashy. But as I kept scrolling through his photos, something weird jumped out at me. He had posted a photo at the same cafe where I'd seen Dee pacing outside, deep in that mysterious phone call, the day I overheard her saying something about starting fresh. Die's stomach twisted the more I scrolled through his profile. The signs weren't blatant, but they were there, quiet little clues that started piecing together a bigger picture. He'd left a comment on one of her photos, "You've got this." Innocent on the surface, sure, but paired with a selfie he'd posted? It looked like it was taken inside her new place. Different lighting, same furniture I helped her pick out before she moved. None of it was hard proof, but it was enough to keep the gears in my head turning. I didn't know exactly what to make of it, but I knew I couldn't just sit there, hoping the answers would fall into my lap. That line she fed me, about a friend helping her see things clearly, kept replaying in my head. I wanted to know who that person really was. So I decided to reach out to someone who might know, Angela. She was one of our mutual friends, had known Dee for years. Figured if anyone had some insight, it'd be her. I kept things casual at first, just asked if she'd talked to Dee lately or if anything seemed off. Her reply came quick, too quick. She claimed she didn't know anything about any friend or guidance Dee was getting. I probed a little more, just lightly pushing, and that's when her tone shifted. Defensive. Abrupt. She shut the conversation down fast, like she didn't want to be part of it. The whole interaction felt like a dodge. Not ready to let it go, I called another friend, Tara. Same approach, casual, friendly, no pressure. She sounded hesitant right off the bat, answering vaguely, like she was choosing every word with caution. And then, just like Angela, she cut the call short when things got even slightly uncomfortable. I sat there in silence, frustrated and unsure of my next step. And then, unexpectedly, Tara called back. Her voice was lower this time, more serious. "I just needed to make sure this doesn't come back to me," she said. I promised her it wouldn't. I was desperate for the truth, and I guess she could hear it in my voice. She took a deep breath, then told me what she knew. Apparently, Dee had been spending a lot of time with a guy named Ryan, someone she'd met through work. Tara didn't know much more, but she'd heard that Ryan was deeply involved in helping Dee navigate the divorce, giving advice, coaching her through it, that kind of thing. Hearing that name, it was like a puzzle piece finally snapping into place. This wasn't about her needing space. This wasn't some soul-searching journey. She had someone in her corner the whole time, guiding her, maybe even pushing her. And now I wanted to know why. So I decided to find out the only way I could, on my own terms. That Saturday, I drove to her apartment building and parked about a block away. I wasn't planning anything dramatic, I just needed to see it with my own eyes. Needed confirmation of what I already knew deep down. A couple hours passed before they came out. There she was, walking beside him, Ryan. They didn't hold hands or anything, but their body language told me everything I needed. They were close. Leaning in when they talked, walking in sync like they'd done this before. Then they got into his car and drove off, leaving me sitting there alone, staring at the empty spot where they'd been standing. I didn't follow. Didn't need to. In that moment, the truth settled in. She hadn't just fallen out of love with me. She'd been preparing to walk into something new with him. All the emotional distance, the weird behavior, the sudden obsession with finances, the legal ambush, it all made sense now. She hadn't just left me. She was trying to strip me bare while walking off hand in hand with someone else. That night, I went home, my head spinning with everything I'd uncovered. The betrayal cut deep, but what hurt the most was how calculated it all was. She wasn't ending our marriage, she was using it. The divorce was just a stepping stone to her next chapter with Ryan. But what she didn't know, was that I had a chapter of my own in the works. Our first mediation session was tense from the second we sat down. Her lawyer came in carrying this monster of a binder, looked like he was about to argue a Supreme Court case. He rattled off her demands like they were perfectly reasonable, half the house, the savings, all the assets, the car, and even spousal support, some vague clause that made no sense given her income. I didn't say a word. Just sat there, listening. Waiting. Then it was our turn. Die attorney calmly slid a thick stack of papers across the table. Before we continue, he said, I think everyone should take a look at these. Her lawyer picked up the documents and started flipping through them. His confident posture started to shift. With every page, his brow furrowed deeper. What is this? He finally asked, narrowing his eyes at my lawyer. These are the legal records of the asset transfers my client made several weeks prior to the divorce filing, my attorney explained, calm as ever. Everything was moved into a fully legal, irrevocable trust under his mother's name. It's already been finalized. Silence fell over the room like a heavy blanket. Her lawyer turned to her, visibly rattled. You didn't mention this, he said flatly. She yanked the papers from his hands and started flipping through them herself. Her face changed instantly, eyes wide, mouth tense, color draining from her cheeks. This can't be real, she said, scanning the notarized documents. The dates. The signatures. Then she turned to me, and her face twisted into something halfway between shock and rage. You planned this, she spat. You knew I was going to file. You set this up to screw me over. I didn't flinch. Didn't answer. Just looked at her, letting her come to her own conclusion. Her lawyer, now clearly off balance, asked mine to clarify further. So he did, slow, precise, and backed by every legal receipt and timestamp needed to shut down any argument. Everything checked out. The timing. The signatures. The legality. There was no hole to poke. They had nothing to stand on. She sat there, fuming. You're unbelievable, she hissed. I can't believe you do this to me. Still, I said nothing. Because this wasn't about revenge. This was about protection. I wasn't trying to hurt her, I was trying to survive what she'd set in motion. The meeting wrapped up with her lawyer muttering something about needing to revisit their strategy, but we all knew the game had changed. She'd come to take everything. Instead, she walked out with nothing but frustration. As we left the building, she grabbed my arm in the hallway. Her face was tight with anger, but there was something else there too, panic. "This isn't over," she said through clenched teeth. "You're going to regret this." I just looked her in the eye and said, "The only thing I regret is trusting you." That's it. After that mediation session, things unraveled faster than I ever expected. It was like flipping a switch, she went from calculated and cold to completely unhinged. The meltdown started almost immediately. First, it was the phone calls. Constant. Non-stop. At the beginning, she tried to sound calm, remorseful, even. Her voicemails had that carefully controlled tone, saying things like, "I think we just need to talk," or "I know this all got messy, but we can still fix it." But I didn't respond. I wasn't playing the game anymore. And the second day? That's when the mask really dropped. Her messages turned into a ping-pong match between sobbing and screaming. One voicemail would be her crying, saying she'd made a huge mistake and didn't want to lose everything we'd built. The next, she'd be yelling, calling me heartless, greedy, blaming me for every wrong turn her life had taken. I ignored it all. Di lawyer had told me not to engage, and honestly, I had no desire to. I was done letting her manipulate the narrative. But she wasn't done, not by a long shot. When the calls and texts didn't get a response, she pivoted. Started spinning stories to our mutual friends. I heard from a few people that she was telling folks the whole divorce was a setup, a hoax. A prank, of all things. A prank? Really? It didn't take long for people to start poking holes in that theory. Friends started asking logical questions. If this was a joke, why file real legal documents, or why get a lawyer and demand specific assets if it wasn't serious? So, she changed the story again. Now it wasn't a prank, it was a test. She told people she'd only done it to see how strong our relationship was, and apparently, my reaction had broken the trust, not hers. She started painting herself as the victim, saying I had gone too far, that I was the one who destroyed what we had. Some people bought it at first. I got weird texts and emails from acquaintances saying things like, "Dan, I didn't know she was going through that much," or "You should have just talked it out instead of being so harsh." Even her brother lashed out at me, saying I'd overreacted and should have handled things more delicately. It was frustrating. But I knew the truth would eventually come out, and sure enough, it did. The turning point came thanks to a guy named Colin. We weren't especially close, but we'd always been cool. A few weeks after mediation, he reached out of the blue. Said he had something I needed to see. When we met up, he pulled out his phone and showed me a string of text messages between Dee and Ryan. I blinked, trying to process what I was looking at. "How did you even get these?" I asked, scrolling through. Turns out Colin and Ryan shared a mutual friend, someone who had overheard bits of conversation and started feeling uneasy about the whole situation. When Ryan began bragging about securing her future, the guy figured out real quick that securing her future actually meant draining me dry. The guy felt guilty keeping quiet, so he took screenshots of the texts and passed them along to Colin, hoping he'd know how to handle it. "This guy's been playing both sides," Colin said, shaking his head. "He's hyping her up to take you for everything, making her believe he's gonna be there for her after it's all said and done." He handed me the phone and said, "You deserve to know, man. You don't deserve what they're doing to you." The texts were gutting. She wasn't venting or expressing confusion, she was planning. Cold, calculated steps. One message from her read, "Once the settlement's done, we'll have everything we need." I just need him to agree to the terms." Ryan replied, "Don't back down. Make him feel guilty if you have to. He owes you. We'll start fresh once you've got the money." I sat there, staring at the screen, feeling like I'd been punched in the gut. This wasn't about heartbreak. This wasn't a marriage falling apart. This was betrayal at the highest level. A strategy. A setup. I thanked Colin and watched him walk away, but my brain was spinning. Everything suddenly clicked: the emotional distance, her sudden obsession with the finances, the aggressive terms in the divorce papers. It wasn't random. It had been part of the plan all along. One Ryan had helped her craft behind closed doors. It didn't take long for those messages to start circulating. Colin shared them with a couple friends, and from there, it spread like wildfire. The narrative flipped almost overnight. Folks who had previously kept quiet or even sided with her started pulling away. The silence turned to whispers, then straight-up avoidance. People saw her differently. Even the ones closest to her ride-or-die circle, began to step back. By the time the divorce was finalized, she was standing on her own. The crowd that once rallied behind her had thinned to just herself and a pile of burned bridges. Her lawyer ended up quietly withdrawing her complaint. There was no legal ground left to stand on. All her bold demands had crumbled under the weight of the documents I'd presented, and the trust I'd built with my mother was airtight. Unbreakable. Ryan disappeared the second things started falling apart. Honestly, I wouldn't be shocked if he used her just as much as she tried to use me. From what I could gather, he'd been feeding her all these shiny promises: freedom, a fresh start, this whole fantasy life. But once it became clear she wasn't walking away with anything, he vanished. Like he was never there. With him gone, her confidence crumbled. The calls kept coming, but the tone was different now: no more accusations, no more shouting. Just desperation. One voicemail said, "Can we just talk, please? I'll do anything to fix this." Another said, "You don't even have to forgive me, but can't we just settle this and move on? I'll drop everything if you just talk to me." But I didn't respond. I couldn't. Too much damage had been done. You don't walk someone back into your life after they've tried to gut it. Even her family started pulling away. Her brother reached out one day and apologized. Said he was sorry for everything he'd said before, when he'd blindly taken her side. "I didn't know what she was doing to you," he admitted. "I'm sorry I believed her." It was one of the few moments in all of this that felt real. As for me, I kept the house. Kept my savings. And, more than anything, I got something I hadn't felt in a long, long time: peace of mind. Di Mom, like always, showed up with her steady presence and a bucket of solutions. Literally. She brought paint, cleaning supplies, and a notebook full of ideas for how I could make the house mine again. Not ours. Dine. And little by little, it started to feel like home again. These days, life feels like it actually belongs to me. No more walking on eggshells. No more guessing what's going on behind someone's eyes. No more betrayal hiding behind a familiar smile. Just peace. She's part of my past now. A chapter I've closed. One I don't go back to read.